They say his ghost still lingers in the narrow alleys of Kyoto, whispering through the lantern-lit dusk like the rustle of silk in a place where blood once soaked the stones. They call him the man who slew the demon king, yet vanished like smoke. 13 days of power, then nothing. And yet, his name refused to die. For while Akechi Mitsuhide's body was left to rot in a muddy ditch, his shadow lived on in the quiet heart of a daughter who would one day redeem what he destroyed. The story of Akechi Mitsuhide begins not with fire, but with silence. He was born in 1528 in the province of Mino, in a minor branch of the Toki clan, a line of fated courtiers who had slipped from the imperial court's golden light into the dim provinces. Japan itself was in freefall. The Ashikaga shogunate had become a hollow husk, and the islands were splintered into 1,000 warlord realms, each vying for power with steel and cunning. Yet amid this age of roaring chaos, the boy Mitsuhide grew into something unusual, a samurai who carried books as carefully as he carried blades. While other boys drilled in spear drills and horseback archery, Mitsuhide immersed himself in the world of poetry and Chinese classics. He memorized the Confucian Analects, wrote elegant waka verses about autumn moonlight and the fleeting scent of plum blossoms. He learned the etiquette of the court, how to bow, how to speak in layered metaphors, how to conceal emotion behind the lacquered mask of propriety. Those who met him in youth described him as refined, careful, self-contained. He cultivated restraint in an era that worshipped reckless valor, and that restraint would one day become his curse. No chronicles record her birth with the same solemn brushstrokes, yet somewhere in those quiet years, his daughter Tama would be born, a tiny flame flickering in the halls of his household. She was not yet the Garasha who would be remembered by centuries. She was simply his child, chasing paper cranes across tatami mats, while her father composed verses at low tables. To her, he was gentle, distant, a figure of measured affection and quiet gravity. She did not know the weight he carried, the ache of watching his world collapse under the boots of men like Oda Nobunaga. When Mitsuhide first entered Nobunaga's service, he was already in his 30s, an unusually late start for a samurai career. He had wandered the courts of central Japan, serving briefly under the Ashikaga shogun Yoshiaki as a political aide and envoy. That role suited him. He understood the delicate dance of hierarchy and flattery that swirled around the imperial court. But Yoshiaki was weak, a paper shogun drowning in factional intrigue. Nobunaga saw it and moved like lightning, marching into Kyoto in 1568 to install Yoshiaki as his puppet. It was here that Mitsuhide found his fate intertwined with the man history would call the Demon King. Nobunaga saw something in Mitsuhide that most warlords could not: an administrator, a man who could impose order on chaos. While others fought battles, Mitsuhide governed Kyoto. He negotiated with court nobles, managed grain taxes, quelled riots, and rebuilt war-torn districts. He walked the incense-thick halls of the imperial palace, bowing to emperors in robes of layered brocade, then returned to command soldiers on muddy roads littered with severed heads. In an age of brutality, he made himself indispensable by being both civilized and ruthless. But serving Nobunaga was like walking a blade. The warlord despised weakness, mocked the old courtly traditions Mitsuhide revered, and lashed out unpredictably at his own vassals. He would laugh like a wolf while ordering temples burned, poets executed, and ancient privileges trampled under iron-shod boots. To Mitsuhide, who still saw value in harmony and precedent, this savagery was a constant wound, yet he endured it. He told himself it was duty. He told himself that someone must stand between Nobunaga's chaos and the fragile heart of Kyoto. And so he became the bridge, the cultured face of a brutal regime. In those years, Tama lived within the walled serenity of Sakamoto, the lakeside castle Mitsuhide built at the edge of Lake Biwa. The castle stood like a painting, white walls rising over rippling water, surrounded by plum groves and peonies. Within its rooms, her father created a miniature court of refinement. He hosted Renga poetry gatherings, studied the art of tea, and invited court nobles fleeing the wars to enjoy moments of peace under his roof. To the outside world, he was a general. To Tama, he was a man of stillness, who moved like a shadow and smelled faintly of ink and sandalwood. Yet even in this sanctuary, the age's violence seeped in. In 1571, Nobunaga ordered the annihilation of the warrior monks of Mount Hiei, who had defied him for years. Mitsuhide marched with the Oda army up the sacred slopes. The monks believed their sacred mountain untouchable. They were wrong. Flames devoured the wooden halls, and the screams of burning monks echoed across Lake Biwa. Mitsuhide's sword was wet with blood by nightfall. He returned to Sakamoto silent, washed his hands in the lake, and sat long into the night before the household shrine. Eyes blank as ash fell on his shoulders. He did not speak of it to Tama, but something in him hardened that autumn, like a porcelain cup hairline cracked from within. Mitsuhide's successes brought rewards. More land, more soldiers, more responsibility. Nobunaga entrusted him with the conquest of Tanba, a mountainous region west of Kyoto. It was a slow war of sieges, starvation, and persuasion. Mitsuhide preferred guile to slaughter. He offered peace to stubborn clans, wrote elegant letters promising mercy, and cut off their supply lines until hunger bent them. It worked. Tanba fell. Nobunaga rewarded him with more estates, yet gave the richest prizes to younger men like Hashiba, Toyotomi, Hideyoshi. Mitsuhide accepted it with a bow, but inside he felt the first stirrings of bitterness. He had poured his life into order, yet chaos was favored. And still Tama grew. She wandered the gardens of Fukuchiyama, plucked camellias, learned calligraphy, and watched her father's face grow older, lined not by time but by care. She could not know what war he waged in his heart. Nobunaga mocked him in front of other generals, calling him slow, pedantic, weak. To be refined was to be despised. Mitsuhide swallowed the insults like bitter tea. But late at night, alone in his study, he stared at his calligraphy scrolls as if they no longer made sense. He had once believed that culture could survive amid fire. Now he wondered if fire would consume everything, including her. In 1579, Mitsuhide secured Tanba entirely after the Honnō clan finally surrendered. He promised them mercy, and they laid down their arms. But Nobunaga, furious at their earlier defiance, ordered Honnō Hideharu executed anyway. The Honnō retainers? Enraged, allegedly captured and killed Mitsuhide's elderly mother in retaliation. The details are murky. Some historians doubt it. But what mattered was how it felt. For Mitsuhide, the lesson was searing. Honor meant nothing to Nobunaga. Promises were tools to be discarded, and his own family could be sacrificed without a thought. He returned to Sakamoto, not as a victor, but as a man gutted. Tama found him kneeling alone before the household shrine, unmoving for hours, like a man carved from stone. Something broke in him then. He began to see Nobunaga not as a master to endure, but as a disease to cure. Nobunaga was tearing apart the old bonds of loyalty, desecrating shrines, humiliating vassals, ruling by terror. If he succeeded, Mitsuhide believed, there would be nothing left worth ruling. The bridge he had built between the court and the sword would collapse. Perhaps he began to think it must be destroyed before it was too late. But Tama only saw her father become quieter, his gaze more distant, as though looking at a world she could not see. She was about 10 then, still small enough to hide behind the silk screens and listen as messengers came and went. She did not understand their words, but she felt the tension in the air, like the taut silence before a storm. She would remember that silence all her life, and so, as the 15 Ekis dawned and Nobunaga's star blazed at its zenith, Mitsuhide's shadow deepened. He served flawlessly, even as resentment hollowed him. He attended court ceremonies dressed in layers of pale silk, bowed to the emperor with immaculate grace, then returned to Nobunaga's war council to watch him bark orders like a feral beast. He had become two men, the loyal vassal and the quiet conspirator. And far away in the heart of that dual life, a girl named Tama carried his blood like an ember waiting for wind. No one could have foreseen that this man of poems and etiquette would strike down the most powerful warlord in Japan. Fewer still could imagine that his name would survive, not through his swords, but through the small, unseen life of the daughter who watched his world burn, and one day would rebuild his honor from its ashes. Kyoto glittered like a blade's edge in the sunlight, beautiful, sharp and always on the verge of drawing blood. In the years after the fall of the warrior monks on Mount Hiei, Mitsuhide became not merely a soldier of Oda Nobunaga, but the very spine of his order in the Kinai region. Nobunaga could crush armies, but only Mitsuhide could make the shattered capital breathe again. And so, as smoke still curled from the ruins on the mountain slopes, he was entrusted with the impossible task to tame Kyoto, a city older than the shogunates themselves, a place of poets and courtiers and intrigue, and make it kneel to the will of a warlord who scorned its ancient elegance. He went about it as he did all things, with meticulous care and cold brilliance. He restored marketplaces and canal routes, curbed banditry, and convinced trembling nobles to resume their rituals. He bowed deeply to the Emperor Ogamachi and wrote reports for Nobunaga in crisp, formal script. While other generals gloried in blood, Mitsuhide gloried in order. He dressed in pale silks while they wore armor, quoted Chinese sages while they boasted of kills. The old families came to respect him as one of their own, the rare samurai who understood their fading world. And Nobunaga, who despised that world, tolerated it because it worked. Yet this duality cut Mitsuhide like a hidden wound. By day he walked the polished halls of the imperial palace, careful not to let his sword scabbard brush the lacquered floors. By night he led armed patrols through the city's shadowed alleys, where Ronin skulked and smoke from burned temples still choked the air. He moved through Kyoto like a man balancing porcelain on his shoulders, always smiling, always calculating. It was said that while Nobunaga ruled with fire, Mitsuhide ruled with ice. In Sakamoto, his castle on the shores of Lake Biwa, he built a world entirely his own, one that stood in defiance of the chaos consuming Japan. Its white walls rose like clouds from the water, and inside, life followed a precise rhythm of tea gatherings, poetry recitals, and the distant sound of court music drifting from Kyoto. Tama grew amid this cultivated stillness. She learned to write characters on fine paper, her small hands steady under her father's guidance. He corrected her posture gently, praised her sparingly, and rarely raised his voice. In a time when most samurai households rang with shouts and the clang of training weapons, Mitsuhide's halls were hushed, as if trying to hold the world at bay. But the world would not stay away. Nobunaga's revolution was accelerating. He swept away old customs, shredded sacred precedents, and made war on anything that smelled of stagnation. He scoffed at Kyoto's ancient ceremonies, mocking the layered robes of the court nobles, refusing the elaborate dances that had enthralled emperors for centuries. To him, they were fossils, and he would build a new world without them. Mitsuhide watched with growing unease. He had fought and bled for this new order, yet its advance filled him with dread. What use was power if it trampled the very culture it sought to rule? He did not speak this aloud, but when he stood on the castle balcony at night, gazing across the lake toward Kyoto's dim glow, the question gnawed at him like an unseen rat behind a wall. The contradiction within him grew sharper with each passing year. On the battlefield, he was merciless. He crushed the last resistance in Tanba with calculated cruelty, cutting off supplies, building siege lines, starving fortresses into surrender. He executed rebel chiefs with cold precision, their heads displayed on pikes as warnings. He did what had to be done. Yet the moment he returned to Sakamoto, he shed the armor like a snake's skin. He composed poetry about the way autumn mist curled through pine branches. He attended tea ceremonies in robes of understated elegance, discussing the texture of porcelain cups while blood still dried on his sword. Those who knew him in Kyoto whispered that he was two men inhabiting one body, one made of steel, the other of silk, and they feared the seam between them might one day tear. Nobunaga, meanwhile, showed him no kindness. The warlord's rise was meteoric, his victories relentless, and he tolerated no rivals in brilliance or pride. He mocked Mitsuhide openly before other generals, calling him the courtier with a sword. Once, when a rice shipment to Kyoto was delayed, Nobunaga summoned him, berated him before the entire council, and threw an inkstone at his feet. Mitsuhide stood motionless, his expression unreadable, while the others watched in nervous silence. Later that night, he walked alone in the moonlit corridors of Sakamoto, and for the first time, his servants saw his hand trembling as he poured his evening tea. He had sworn loyalty, yet loyalty was returned with humiliation. Something small but vital in him began to crack. Tama sensed it, though she could not name it. She was perhaps 8 or 9 then, curious and watchful, with her father's quiet eyes. She saw how he grew more distant, how he would pause in the middle of speaking, as if listening to some voice only he could hear. When she showed him a poem she had copied in her careful script, he smiled faintly but did not seem to see it. Sometimes she would wake at night and find him kneeling before the household shrine, motionless as stone, the candles guttering low. Once she crept closer and saw tears on his cheeks. It frightened her. He had always seemed carved from iron. Now he seemed hollow, as though something were eating him from within. Yet to the world, Mitsuhide appeared unshakable. Nobunaga relied on him more than ever. When disputes flared among the fractious nobles of Kyoto, it was Mitsuhide who smoothed them with precise words and veiled threats. When grain prices spiked, he organized emergency shipments from his domains. He was the invisible machinery behind Nobunaga's brilliance, the hand that kept the wheels from flying apart. And still, Nobunaga pushed him aside when it came to glory. The richest lands went to others, especially the rising star Hashiba Hideyoshi, whose charm and daring made him Nobunaga's favorite. Mitsuhide, older and graver, watched this with the serenity of a man swallowing poison, drop by drop. The resentment smoldered quietly, but it did not consume him. Yet, he still believed in the possibility of harmony, that Nobunaga's raw power could be tempered by the old virtues if men like himself stayed close enough to guide him. He saw himself as a bridge, one foot in the world of blood, the other in the world of culture. It was a dangerous place to stand, but he had stood there so long he could not imagine leaving it. He believed that if he endured the insults, if he bore the weight, he could preserve something worth passing to Tama. That belief became his shield. It also became his cage. For Tama, the world seemed stable, even serene. She practiced calligraphy, played the koto, and watched the seasons wheel past the paper doors. But outside the castle, Japan convulsed like a wounded animal. Clans rose and fell like sparks in a fire. Nobunaga dreamed of unifying the fractured realm under his rule, and his wars carved bloody scars across the map. Mitsuhide helped him carve them. Yet with each conquest, the old bonds that had once knit Japan together, loyalty, tradition, reverence, frayed further. Mitsuhide saw it more clearly than most, and somewhere deep inside he began to fear that he was helping to destroy not only the past, but the future his daughter would live in. He told no one. He wrapped the fear in layers of ceremony and silence, as he wrapped himself in his pale silk robes each morning. To his retainers, he remained the perfect lord, disciplined, scholarly, and impenetrable. To Nobunaga, he was a tool. To Tama, he was her father, distant but enduring, like a mountain always on the horizon. She could not know that beneath that mountain, fault lines were beginning to shift. One day they would tear the earth open. The year the chrysanthemum cracked began like any other. Soft rains over Kyoto, the scent of plum blossoms curling through the palace gardens, and Akechi Mitsuhide moving with his usual deliberate grace through the lacquered halls. To the world, nothing seemed amiss. He was still Nobunaga's steward of the Kanai, the man who kept the old capital breathing while the rest of Japan howled in war. He still hosted elegant poetry gatherings at Sakamoto, still offered tea in bowls of subtle glaze to visiting courtiers, still spoke in measured tones even when others shouted. But inside, something was shifting, subtle as a fault line deep beneath the earth. He had balanced on the knife edge between worlds for too long, and the blade was beginning to bite. Tanba had been his masterpiece. The province was a rugged quilt of valleys and steep ridges west of Kyoto, defended by stubborn mountain clans who had resisted Oda domination for years. Most of Nobunaga's generals would have stormed it in fire and blood. Mitsuhide chose patience. He cut roads to choke their supply lines, built alliances with discontented sub-clans, and offered mercy in letters written with impeccable courtesy. It took years, but it worked. Fortress after fortress yielded. By 1579, Tanba lay quiet beneath his banner. It should have been his triumph. Instead, it became the beginning of his ruin. The Hatano clan were the last and proudest of Tanba's holdouts. When they finally surrendered, It was to Mitsuhide's word. He promised them clemency. They laid down their arms, trusting him. But Nobunaga had no use for such niceties. He ordered Hatano Hideharu executed without warning, as casually as one might prune a dead branch. To Nobunaga, it was a show of strength. To Mitsuhide, it was a betrayal that tore through everything he had built. Not just the fragile peace in Tanbe, but the very fabric of honor he had wrapped around his soul. The Hatano retainers, enraged, struck back in a way that stunned even that brutal age. According to later accounts, they seized Mitsuhide's elderly mother, who had been living under the Akechi roof, and killed her in revenge. Whether this is fact or legend has blurred with time, but in that moment it did not matter. What mattered was that Mitsuhide believed it, or needed to. The story took root in him like a poisoned thorn. He had kept faith, and faith had killed his mother. He returned from Tanba not as a victor, but as a man hollowed. The Sakamoto retainers whispered of how he rode through the castle gates with his eyes fixed on nothing, his armor splattered with mud, though the day was clear. That night, Tama found him kneeling before the household shrine, motionless for hours, his sword laid across his lap as if he were deciding something unspeakable. She stood in the doorway, afraid to breathe. He did not look at her. She was perhaps 10 then, still soft-cheeked, with ink stains on her fingers from her calligraphy practice. She could not comprehend what had changed, only that the air around him had grown colder, as though winter had settled inside him while the garden still bloomed. From that point, the cracks spread quickly. Nobunaga's disdain became more open. At council, he interrupted Mitsuhide with mocking laughter, dismissed his careful plans as timid, praised Hideyoshi's reckless brilliance instead. Hideyoshi was everything Mitsuhide was not: charismatic, daring, born of nothing, and hungry for everything. Nobunaga loved him for it. Mitsuhide watched as rewards flowed to the younger man: rich provinces, lavish titles, the glow of favor. Mitsuhide, older and graver, was left with the work no one applauded. He maintained Kyoto, balanced its fragile courtly egos, enforced its grain levies, but glory passed him by like a banner in the wind. This would have stung any man, but for Mitsuhide, it was more than pride. It was proof that the world he valued, order, loyalty, refinement, was being swept away. Nobunaga was building a new Japan on naked ambition. The old codes of obligation, of reciprocity between lord and vassal, were crumbling. Mitsuhide had believed he could be the bridge, that he could stand between Nobunaga's fire and the court's silk and hold them together. Now he saw that the fire meant to consume the silk entirely, and if that happened, there would be nothing left for Tama but ashes. She sensed the tension, though she could not name it. The household had grown quieter. The poetry gatherings stopped. Her father's retainers spoke in low voices. Mitsuhide still rose before dawn, still trained with sword and bow, still sat perfectly upright in council, but the light had gone out of him. When he looked at her, it was with a kind of sorrow, as if she were something delicate he had no right to touch. She was too young to understand the weight he carried, that he was beginning to see himself not as Nobunaga's servant, but as the last thin thread holding back the collapse of the old world. And that thread was fraying. Even Kyoto seemed to sense it. The city was tense, brittle. Nobunaga's reforms had disrupted its ancient rhythms. Merchants thrived, but nobles sulked in half-empty mansions, their ancestral privileges shredded. The great temples were silent ruins. The streets were crowded with rough soldiers from distant provinces, swaggering where once only courtiers had walked. Mitsuhide walked among them like a ghost from another age, bowing to ragged shopkeepers who scarcely knew who he was, then returning to the palace to kneel before the emperor with flawless courtesy. The dissonance was unbearable. He was becoming a stranger everywhere, too cultured for the warriors, too stained for the courtiers. What kept him from breaking was Tama. She was the one thing in his life unsullied by politics, ambition, or blood. When he watched her write poems in the garden, her sleeves trailing in the breeze, he felt something close to hope. She was proof that beauty could endure. Yet even this became another source of torment, because he knew he could not protect her from the world Nobunaga was making. He had seen what became of daughters in the wake of fallen houses. They were taken as hostages, married off as political tokens, or discarded entirely. He could not bear to imagine her soft hands shackled to a fate like that, and so the thought grew in him like a black seed. If Nobunaga were gone, perhaps the world could be made safe again. It was not yet treason, not yet. It was still just a whisper, an unformed shape lurking behind his thoughts as he walked Kyoto's narrow streets at dusk. But each humiliation, each insult, each new atrocity fanned it. Nobunaga's empire grew larger, and Mitsuhide's faith grew smaller. The bridge he had built between the old and the new was cracking underfoot. He had spent his life believing that duty was the highest virtue. Now he wondered if duty to a tyrant was itself a crime. The chrysanthemum, the imperial emblem, symbol of eternal harmony, had always seemed unbreakable. But that year Mitsuhide saw the petals curling black at the edges, and somewhere deep within him, quiet and deadly as winter frost, the thought took root. If the flower cannot be saved, then the blade must fall. Kyoto lay hushed under a warm June night, the air heavy with the perfume of early summer blossoms, when Akechi Mitsuhide finally chose to set the world on fire. For years he had lived like a man walking across thin ice, poised between two worlds, one of silk and one of steel, hoping they could be reconciled. But the cracks had spread too far. He had watched Nobunaga trample ancient bonds, mock the court Mitsuhide revered, and discard loyalty like ashes. He had offered patience, order, restraint, and been rewarded with humiliation, scorn, and the blood of his own kin. Now he would offer something else. Not counsel, not compromise. Only annihilation. The decision came not in a thunderclap, but in a whisper. He was summoned to join Nobunaga's campaign against the Mori clan in the Chugoku region, ordered to bring reinforcements to aid Hashiba Hideyoshi. But instead of marching west, Mitsuhide quietly turned his army toward Kyoto. The timing was perfect in its cold logic. Nobunaga had left for the capital ahead of his main force, traveling lightly with only a small retinue. He was lodged at the temple of Honnō-ji, surrounded by the relaxed air of victory, believing himself untouchable. No guards watched the roads from Sakamoto. No one suspected the dutiful Mitsuhide of treachery, and so in silence, he began to move the pieces. At dawn on the 21st day of the 6th month, 1582, Mitsuhide led his troops out of Sakamoto Castle. They marched under fluttering banners bearing the Akechi Bell crest, their iron-clad feet drumming a rhythm that echoed off the misted hills. The soldiers thought they were bound for Chugoku. Mitsuhide rode at their head, his face unreadable, his mind burning with cold fire. Hours passed in grim silence. Then as they crossed the Kamo River on the outskirts of Kyoto, he gave the order that would etch his name into eternity. "The enemy," he said, "is at Honnō-ji." Those 6 words detonated like thunder. The soldiers froze, stunned, then erupted into frantic murmurs. But Mitsuhide's officers, bound by duty, snapped the ranks back into motion. The banners of the Akechi unfurled crimson against the pale morning sky as they turned toward the sleeping city. Kyoto was still half asleep when the Akechi army swept in like a tide of iron. The streets rang with hoofbeats and the shrill cries of startled birds. Peasants and merchants scattered, pulling their children inside as the armored columns surged past. Mitsuhide gave no speech, no declaration of rebellion. He did not call it vengeance, though the ghost of his murdered mother walked beside him. He did not call it ambition, though the throne of Japan seemed within reach. He called it necessary. He had convinced himself that Nobunaga was a blight, that by striking him down he could save the realm from descending into an age of pure tyranny. It was a cold and terrible logic, but it steadied him. He was no longer the bridge between worlds. He was the blade that would sever them. They reached Honnō-ji at dawn. The temple complex was still and peaceful, the sound of cicadas rising in the warm air. Nobunaga's guards, few and lax, barely had time to shout before the first musket volley tore through them. Mitsuhide's men stormed the gates, their war cries shattering the morning calm. Smoke curled from the thatched roofs as fire arrows hissed through the air. Inside, Nobunaga woke to the chaos, realized the trap, and fought with desperate fury. He cut down attackers until his sword arm faltered, until the flames roared up the wooden beams around him. Then, seeing no escape, He retreated into the inner chamber and took his own life amid the smoke and fire, his body consumed before it could fall into enemy hands. By mid-morning, the Demon King was gone. Honnō-ji was a blackened husk, its charred timbers crackling under the summer sun. Mitsuhide stood amid the ruin, his armor streaked with soot, his face blank as stone. Around him the city trembled. Courtiers locked their gates, merchants shuttered their stalls. Priests muttered prayers as if the heavens themselves might split. Nobunaga, who had seemed as inevitable as the sunrise, had vanished in a single blaze. And Mitsuhide, the quiet, meticulous, long-scorned Mitsuhide, was suddenly the most powerful man in Japan. He wasted no time. While his men still rooted out Nobunaga's remnants in Kyoto, he sent proclamations to the imperial court, promising to preserve order and protect the emperor. He sent messages to wary daimyo, inviting their allegiance. He named himself guardian of the realm, framing his coup not as rebellion, but as purification. In his mind, he was restoring balance, saving Japan from chaos. He believed history would see him not as a traitor, but as a savior. But history was not watching yet. History was still in shock. And in Sakamoto, far from the smoke-choked ruins of Honnō-ji, a young girl named Tama felt her world collapse. The castle that had been her sanctuary erupted with whispers. Servants fled in the night. Retainers argued in frantic voices, some vowing to defend the Akechi name, others quietly disappearing before the storm broke. Tama wandered the silent corridors, clutching her calligraphy brush like a talisman, listening to the distant thunder of hooves as her father's messengers raced back and forth. She did not know the words they spoke, shogun, treason, regicide, but she felt their weight. Even at 11, she understood what no one dared say. Her father had stepped off the bridge he had built, and there was no path back. The flames at Honnō-ji marked more than Nobunaga's death. They marked the death of the old Mitsuhide, the cautious bridge builder who had tried to hold two worlds together. In his place stood a man of pure resolve, stripped of hesitation, moving with the cold momentum of a falling blade. He believed he could kill the chaos and rebuild order on its ashes. He believed he could protect the court, the emperor, perhaps even Tama, by seizing the storm with his own hands. What he did not see, not yet, was the other fire already racing toward him. Because far to the west on the battlefields of the Chugoku campaign, Hashiba Hideyoshi had just received the news, and he was turning his army around. For 13 days, Akechi Mitsuhide held the sun in his hands. For 13 days, the impossible seemed real, that the man who had lived half his life in Nobunaga's shadow could remake Japan in his own image. And for 13 days, as Kyoto bowed beneath his banners, he believed the world might forgive him. But beneath the silence of the capital, the ground was already trembling. The city had woken from the ashes of Honnō-ji like a stunned animal. Nobunaga's death had shattered the illusion of inevitability that had bound it in fear. Merchants whispered behind closed shutters, courtiers huddled in half-abandoned mansions, priests burned incense to cleanse the air. Everyone watched Mitsuhide. He moved through the imperial palace like a man gliding over ice, elegant and unhurried, presenting himself not as a usurper, but as a protector. He offered the Emperor Ogemachi formal pledges to guard the throne, bowed until his forehead brushed the tatami, and sent rich gifts to the court nobles who had once sneered at him. He dressed not in war armor, but in layered silk robes of subdued color, his voice low and measured as he addressed the ancient families. It worked. At first, the court accepted his proclamations. The nobles began to emerge from hiding. The city stirred. Even Mitsuhide's own soldiers, who had expected chaos, felt a strange calm settle over Kyoto. It seemed for a moment as though the impossible coup had succeeded. Yet power gained by fire rarely cools into peace. Mitsuhide had killed Nobunaga, but he had not destroyed Nobunaga's world. The Oda realm stretched like a spiderweb across half of Japan, held together not by law, but by fear of Nobunaga himself. Without him, the web trembled. The great lords who had once bent their knees in terror now hesitated, sniffing the air like wolves, unsure whether to pounce or flee. They watched Mitsuhide and waited to see if he could hold what he had taken. He could not. The first cracks came quietly. The Mori clan, whom Nobunaga had been poised to crush, celebrated his death and stood firm in the west. In the Oda heartlands, Niwanagahide and Shibata Katsuya hesitated, unwilling to commit to Mitsuhide. Tokugawa Ieyasu, stranded with a small escort in Sakai when the news reached him, slipped away across the dangerous Iga Mountains, avoiding Mitsuhide's men entirely. None of them rushed to join the new regime. They watched, weighing their odds. Only Hashiba Hideyoshi moved, and he moved like a thunderclap. When the news reached him at the siege of Takamatsu in the Chugoku region, he understood at once what others only dimly grasped. Speed would decide everything. He made peace with the Mori clan overnight, swore oaths to halt the fighting, and turned his army around. What followed became legend, the Chugoku Ogaishi, the Great Forced March. His men trudged through the rains of late June, covering over 200 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, their armor streaked with mud, their feet bleeding. Villages along the route gave them rice and salt as they passed, sensing they were riding the wind of history. Hideyoshi drove them like a man possessed, his banners snapping like lightning above the sodden fields. By the time Mitsuhide had consolidated Kyoto, Hideyoshi was already climbing the passes east of Himeji, an iron tide surging toward him. Mitsuhide tried to build alliances but found only silence. The Hosokawa, his longtime acquaintances, wavered. The Tsutsui hesitated. Even his own retainers murmured doubts. The stigma of treachery clung to him like smoke. To many, his coup had been too sudden, too shocking, too stained. He wrote letters, offered bribes, promised rank, but no great lords committed. He had removed Nobunaga, yet stood alone in the ruin. And through it all, in Sakamoto Castle, Tama watched her father's world unravel. She was 11, old enough to understand that something monstrous had happened, though too young to see the political currents swirling around it. Servants fled in the night, taking heirlooms and scrolls. The once orderly halls filled with whispers and fear. She saw her father only in glimpses, striding through the corridors in lacquered armor, his eyes like dark glass. He no longer paused to correct her calligraphy, no longer lingered in the garden. He was consumed by something vast and terrible. She sensed it even if she did not yet know the word for it. Desperation. He gathered what forces he could, perhaps 10,000 men, and marched out from Sakamoto to confront Hideyoshi. He moved toward the narrow plain of Yamazaki, south of Kyoto, hoping to block Hideyoshi's advance before the rival general could gather more support. The land there lay between the mountains and the Yodo River, a bottleneck where terrain could favor the defender. Mitsuhide counted on discipline, on the careful strategies that had served him so long. But strategy cannot conjure trust, and trust had deserted him. Hideyoshi arrived like a storm. His exhausted army had swelled with new recruits from among the wavering Oda vassals, drawn to his banner by the sheer audacity of his speed. They poured onto the Yamazaki plain in waves, drums pounding, voices roaring. He seized the heights of Mount Tenazan, overlooking Mitsuhide's positions, and rained musket fire down onto the Akechi lines. Mitsuhide's troops fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, outflanked, and disheartened. Many had marched under him out of duty, not belief, and as the battle turned, they began to melt away. The rout was swift and brutal. Mitsuhide's formations collapsed under the musket volleys and the screaming charges of Hideyoshi's front lines. He tried to rally them, but the tide was unstoppable. Within hours, the Akechi army disintegrated. Mitsuhide fled with only a handful of retainers, his banners trampled into the mud, the dream of his new order dissolving like mist. On the road east toward Sakamoto, peasants armed with bamboo spears ambushed his small party. Mitsuhide was thrown from his horse, struck in the face, and cut down in the mud. Some accounts say he muttered, "The world is a tangle of dreams," before he died. Others say he cried nothing at all. Either way, the man who had dared to kill the Demon King perished not on a battlefield, but in a ditch, torn apart by nameless farmers. 13 days. That was all the reign of Akechi Mitsuhide lasted. 13 days between the fire at Honnō-ji and the mud of Yamazaki. In Sakamoto, Tama stood in the courtyard as news of his death arrived. She did not cry. The retainers around her knelt, stunned, their faces hollow with fear. Already word was spreading that the victors would burn Sakamoto to the ground. She looked at the castle walls, the gardens where she had practiced her brushstrokes and felt them recede as if she were watching from far away. Her father's name had become a curse. She was the daughter of a traitor now, and though she did not yet know it, this moment would shape the rest of her life. The moment she learned that names can burn down faster than cities. By nightfall, the Akechi clan had ceased to exist. When the smoke of Yamazaki cleared, nothing of the Akechi name remained but whispers and fear. Mitsuhide's body had been left in a muddy ditch, torn by peasants and buried without ceremony. His castles were seized, his banners trampled, his retainers scattered to the winds. And in the halls of Sakamoto, where music and poetry had once floated through the air like incense, silence settled like dust over broken lacquer. Tama stood at the heart of that silence, the last living ember of a house reduced to ashes. She was 11, small and solemn. Her world collapsed overnight. The servants who had once bowed at her approach now avoided her gaze. Retainers argued in hoarse whispers about what to do with her. The new order branded the Akechi as traitors, and vengeance often fell on traitors' children as surely as on their men. To shelter her was to risk ruin. And yet some among her father's old followers still remembered the quiet girl trailing behind Mitsuhide's robes like a shadow. Out of duty or love, or perhaps guilt, they spirited her away from Sakamoto before Hideyoshi's men arrived to torch it. The castle burned behind her as she was smuggled through back roads, hidden in the false bottom of a palanquin, wrapped in plain cloth. She did not look back. The child who had practiced calligraphy in silk sleeves was gone. What remained was a fugitive with nothing but her name, and that name had become poison. They moved her from one sympathetic household to another, never staying long, never speaking her father's name. She learned to move quietly, to keep her head bowed, to listen more than she spoke. The world seemed to have grown colder. When she stepped into a room, people paused as if a draft had entered. She could feel the way they measured her with their eyes, as though trying to see if treachery itself was stamped on her skin. Years passed this way, a drifting shadow in the fractured world left by Nobunaga's death. Japan convulsed with new wars, Hideyoshi consolidating power, former Oda vassals fighting for scraps, clans shifting allegiance like reeds in the wind. None of it touched her directly, yet it shaped the air she breathed. She belonged nowhere. She had no land, no dowry, no protection. Even those who sheltered her did so uneasily, as though she were a blade left forgotten in a drawer, dangerous to touch. When she entered her teenage years, talk began to circle around her future, or what remained of it. A samurai woman's worth was measured in her ability to seal alliances, to bear heirs, to cement loyalty between houses. But Tama had nothing to offer except the ghost of a man everyone feared to name. She might have faded entirely into obscurity, married off to some minor retainer in exchange for silence, if not for an unexpected hand that reached from the new power rising over Japan. That hand belonged to Hosokawa Tadaoki. Tadaoki was young, fierce, and ambitious, the heir of the Hosokawa, an old and prestigious clan now aligning itself under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was barely in his 20s, already hardened by campaigns, already marked by the cold sharpness of men born to command. To him, Tama was not a girl, but a political instrument. Marrying the daughter of Mitsuhide could serve two purposes at once. It would neutralize any lingering Akechi sympathizers by binding her to a loyal Toyotomi vassal, and it would elevate his own prestige by claiming even the bloodline of a fallen rival. The proposal came like a blade slipped between ribs. She was perhaps 15. She had no choice. They dressed her in wedding silks of muted blue, painted her face white, pinned her hair with tortoiseshell combs. As she was led into the Hosokawa residence, the retainers lining the halls watched her with thin, fixed smiles. She could feel their wariness as a physical weight, as though the walls themselves recoiled from her. Her new husband stood at the far end of the chamber, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He did not speak to her. Life in the Hosokawa household was colder than exile. Tadaoki treated her with suspicion, as though she were a coiled snake placed in his bed by political necessity. He rarely visited her chambers. When he did, his words were clipped, his gaze distant. The women of the household, loyal to him, watched Tama constantly, searching for signs of the treachery they were certain must run in her blood. She learned to move with quiet precision, to keep her eyes lowered, to speak only when spoken to. But beneath the surface, something within her refused to break. She had been hollowed by ruin, yes, but not erased. In that hollow space, she began to build something new. She rose before dawn to pray. She copied poetry, verses late into the night, her brush steady and patient. She tended the small garden behind her chambers, coaxing fragile flowers from the stony earth. These were small acts, invisible to the powerful men who decided her fate. Yet they were hers. They were proof that she still existed beyond the name that had nearly destroyed her. Over time, the sharp edges of suspicion dulled, though never disappeared. The Hosokawa household came to see her not as dangerous, but as distant, like a pale moon glimpsed through winter clouds. Tadaoki himself remained a cold presence, gone for months on campaign, returning streaked with dust and blood, speaking to her as one might to an elegant ornament. She did not protest. She did not beg for warmth. She carried herself with quiet dignity, the same distant grace her father had once worn like armor. Yet inside she carried something her father had never found, the will to endure without vengeance. Years passed. Japan changed again. Hideyoshi's star rose higher. He became Kampaku, regent of the imperial court, and the Toyotomi regime tightened its grip over the realm. The wars receded for a time. Peace returned to the capital. Tama's life settled into a still rhythm of ritual and watchfulness, a life neither free nor miserable, suspended like a moth in amber. But the shadow of her father never left her. It lived in the way people's eyes flickered when they remembered who she was, in the hush that followed her name. It lived in the dreams that woke her at night, flames consuming the temple at Honnō-ji, the world collapsing in smoke and screams. She would sit alone in the garden until dawn, listening to the wind in the pines, trying to understand how a man so devoted to order had birthed such chaos, and how she could ever escape the ruin that bore her. She did not yet know it, but the answer would come from a world far beyond anything her father had imagined. A strange, forbidden faith carried by wandering foreign priests, whispering of forgiveness and eternity. And through that door, she would begin to reclaim not her father's honor, but her own soul. The world that had crushed her father was built on iron and silence, and Hosokawa Tama lived within its cold machinery like a ghost. Years passed in the rigid stillness of the Hosokawa household, each day a careful performance of obedience. She rose with the dawn, bowed to elders, attended tea ceremonies where every gesture was measured to the width of a fingertip. She spoke little, smiled less. The other women called her graceful, but always in the tone one uses for something breakable, like porcelain. They did not see the tension beneath her stillness, the way she carried herself as though bracing against an invisible wind. She was the daughter of a man whose name could not be spoken. Even now, long after Mitsuhide's body had rotted in the mud, his ghost hovered around her. Whispers trailed her through the corridors. Traitor's blood, rebel's child. When Tadaoki looked at her, it was not with love, but calculation, as though measuring how long it might take treachery to bloom in her veins. He left her alone for long stretches, vanishing on campaigns or disappearing into strategy councils. When he returned, he brought the smell of steel and blood, speaking to her with the careful politeness one gives a wild animal that might bite. Yet in the stillness of her solitude, a faint light began to grow. It came first as a rumor, strange foreign men in black robes, preaching an alien faith in the alleys of Kyoto. They were Jesuits, emissaries of a distant Europe, wandering through the fractured land with crucifixes hidden under their cloaks. The Toyotomi regime tolerated them for their trade connections, but watched them warily. Christianity was forbidden to the highborn, especially women of samurai houses. Yet the whispers reached Tama like an echo from another world, a world not ruled by blood and vengeance, but by forgiveness. She heard fragments from a maid who had seen them at a roadside chapel, that they spoke of a single God who loved even the lowliest, that sins could be washed away, that death was not the end. The words struck her like a blow. She had grown up in a world where shame was permanent, where disgrace stained families for generations, where her father's rebellion had branded her forever. The notion that guilt could be absolved, that the past could be cut loose like a shadow at noon, seemed impossible. And yet, she could not stop thinking about it. She began seeking scraps of their teachings in secret. She bribed a merchant's boy with a silk hairpin to bring her a fragment of a Christian prayer, written in awkward kana. She copied it at night by lamplight, her brush trembling. She memorized it until she could whisper it without looking. She felt as if she were holding a flame cupped in her hands, small but real. In time, one of the Jesuits' Japanese converts arranged a clandestine meeting. It took place in a deserted tea house at the edge of Kyoto, under cover of a routine excursion. Tama wore plain robes and traveled with only 2 attendants who thought she was visiting a shrine. Inside the shadowed tea house, a thin Portuguese priest waited, his face hollow from years of wandering. He spoke Japanese haltingly, gently, and told her of Christ, of mercy, of the soul's worth, of a love that endured even through betrayal and death. She listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the worn wooden floor, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must hear it. When he offered to baptize her, she bowed her head. He poured water over her hair and spoke the Latin words she could barely understand. And in that moment, she shed the name that had chained her to ruin. She became Garasha. It was a secret name, a secret faith, hidden from her husband, her household, the entire samurai world. If Tadaoki discovered it, she would be cast out or killed. The risk only sharpened her resolve. She practiced the prayers at night, whispering them like contraband, feeling them burn through the layers of ritual and fear that had smothered her since childhood. Each word was a rebellion, not of steel, but of the soul. Through that hidden faith, she began to reinterpret the man who had shaped and destroyed her life. She thought of her father, kneeling motionless before the household shrine in Sakamoto, his face carved from stone. She remembered the silence that had surrounded him, the weight that had bowed his shoulders, the fire that had consumed him. For years she had wondered whether he had loved her at all, or whether she had simply been a delicate ornament in a life too filled with war. But as she whispered her new prayers, she began to see him differently, not as a monster or hero, but as a soul lost in the storm. He had tried to build order out of chaos and had been devoured by it. She prayed for him. It was the most radical act she had ever committed. In the world she had been born into, the dead carried their stains forever. To pray for her father's soul was to defy the verdict of history. She did it anyway. Night after night she knelt alone on the tatami, tears falling silently, asking her strange new God to forgive the man the world would never forgive. The act changed her. She grew calmer, less brittle. The watchfulness that had once been pure fear became something steadier, more deliberate. The women of the household began to notice the difference. They said she seemed radiant, though they could not explain why. Even Tadaoki sensed it. He still kept his distance, but when he looked at her now, there was a flicker of something else. Wariness, perhaps even respect. Beyond the walls of her quiet rebellion, the world shifted again. Hideyoshi grew old and increasingly desperate to secure his legacy. He named his infant son heir, forced the great lords to swear oaths, and tried to bind the realm together through sheer will. But cracks were forming. The old Oda loyalists muttered in the shadows. The Tokugawa watched and waited. Factions sharpened their blades behind layers of silk. Garasha moved through this gathering storm like a still point. She had been born into fire, raised in exile, forged in suspicion. Now, with her secret faith glowing like an ember inside her, she felt strangely beyond their reach. The men could claw for power, betray one another, burn the world down again if they wished. She would not be consumed this time. She had found a truth that could not be taken from her. And yet, as the rumble of distant conflict grew louder, she sensed that the world would not let her remain untouched forever. The age of silence and survival was ending. The age of choices was coming. The years of stillness were ending. Japan, which had seemed for a time to settle under Toyotomi Hideyoshi's iron grip, began to shudder again like earth before an earthquake. Hideyoshi's once mighty frame had withered into frailty, his hair silvered, his hands shook. He had climbed from peasant origins to rule the realm, but time was an enemy he could not conquer. And as his body faltered, the delicate edifice of his order began to crack. He had named his infant son Hideyori as heir, forcing the great lords to swear oaths of loyalty. It was an unnatural arrangement. Warlords who had clawed their way to power by fire and blood now commanded to serve a child. They obeyed while Hideyoshi lived, their ambitions sheathed, but beneath their bows lay sharpened blades. Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient as winter, gathered quiet allies. Ishida Mitsunari, sharp-tongued and fanatically loyal to the Toyotomi, schemed to protect the boy heir at any cost. And between them, like flint and steel about to spark, stretched the brittle peace. In the Hosokawa mansion in Kyoto, Garasha watched this tension coil tighter each day. She had grown into full womanhood now, no longer the frightened exile girl who had crept through Sakamoto's ruins. Her bearing was serene, her voice low, her movements precise as calligraphy strokes. But beneath the polished stillness, she was sharper than glass. Her secret faith had burned away fear. She carried herself as if she had made peace with death long ago. Tadaoki had risen high in these turbulent years, his reputation forged on the battlefield. He had fought for Hideyoshi in Korea, returned scarred and seasoned, and now held vast lands in Busan. Ambition gleamed cold in him, yet he still approached his wife like a man circling something dangerous. Their relationship had settled into a ritual of distance, polite, formal, untouched by tenderness. He respected her composure, but did not understand it. He could not see that she no longer lived by the rules of his world at all. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, the fragile balance shattered. The Toyotomi regions splintered into factions. The eastern lords rallying to Tokugawa Ieyasu, the western lords clinging to the Toyotomi banner under Ishida Mitsunari. Both sides scrambled to secure hostages from powerful families, knowing that control over wives and children could force wavering men into obedience. Ishida, clever and ruthless, fixed his eyes on Garasha. She was more than a wife, she was leverage. The Hosokawa were powerful, and Tadaoki's allegiance could tilt the balance. Ishida believed that if he could seize Garasha, hold her within the Toyotomi stronghold at Osaka, Tadaoki would be bound by blood to their cause. She was the perfect hostage, high-born, elegant, and, he thought, vulnerable. Garasha saw the trap tightening even before the messengers arrived. She knew how the samurai world worked. Women were pawns, collateral, living chains for their husband's loyalty. It had happened 1,000 times before, and now it was coming for her. She could feel the walls closing, the air growing thin. Servants whispered of Ishida's envoys approaching Kyoto. Tadaoki sent frantic orders from the front, commanding her to prepare to be moved to Osaka for her safety. She understood what safety meant. It meant captivity, dishonor, becoming a bargaining chip in a game of men's ambitions. It meant erasure, the extinguishing of everything she had endured to become who she was. She walked alone in the garden that night, under the crescent moon. The wind rattled the bamboo like bones. She thought of her father kneeling before the household shrine in Sakamoto, his face carved from sorrow. He had believed he could seize power to protect what he loved, and it had destroyed him. She would not repeat his error. She would not grasp at life and lose herself. She called her closest maid and gave quiet instructions. If Ishida's men came, she was not to be taken alive. The maid wept. Garasha's voice did not waver. She began to prepare as if for a ceremony. She burned her letters, her poetry, her childhood scrolls. She prayed through the night, whispering her secret Latin prayers until the sky paled. In the gray light of dawn, she dressed not in somber robes, but in her finest silks, pale lavender embroidered with silver chrysanthemums. She arranged her hair as if for a wedding. When she looked in the polished bronze mirror, her face was calm, luminous, almost unearthly. She had never looked more alive. The next day, Ishida's soldiers surrounded the Hosokawa mansion. They came in armored ranks, their spears glinting, their voices cold with certainty. Inside, the retainers panicked. Some wanted to open the gates to avoid bloodshed. Others shouted to resist. Amid the chaos, Garasha stood like stone. She ordered the gates barred, the women withdrawn. Then she knelt in her chamber and folded her hands. Her maid did as she had been commanded. A single cry rang out, sharp and brief. When Ishida's men forced the gates, they found the mansion engulfed in fire. The retainers had set it ablaze to deny the enemy her body. Smoke curled into the Kyoto sky as they withdrew, shaken. They had come to take a hostage. They left having created a martyr. Tadaoki, far from Kyoto, received the news in silence. He said nothing for a long time. Then he raised his banners for Tokugawa Ieyasu. At Sekigahara, the Hosokawa fought ferociously for the Eastern Army, helping crush Ishida's coalition and end the Toyotomi reign. Garasha's death had reshaped the board more decisively than any army. She had chosen the one path the samurai world could not anticipate, to die not in battle or vengeance, but in refusal. She had broken the rules completely, and in doing so, transcended them. The woman once known as Tama, the traitor's daughter, had shattered her cage. And in her death, she would become something more dangerous than a hostage, more enduring than a pawn. She would become a legend. When the flames of the Hosokawa mansion guttered out and the smoke drifted away on the wind, what remained of Garasha was not a body, nor even ashes. It was a silence so profound it seemed to hollow the air. Ishida Mitsunari's men searched the blackened ruins for proof of her death, but there was nothing. No bones, no ornaments, no trace. It was as if she had dissolved into the fire itself, denying her enemies even the satisfaction of possession. The city of Kyoto whispered her name in awe and fear. They had come to take a hostage and found only smoke, only emptiness. Words spread like wildfire, slipping along the same courier routes that carried news of war. By the time it reached the battle camps gathering on the misted plains of Sekigahara, it had already become legend. They said she had knelt calmly in her silks as the flames rose, that her face had glowed like moonlight, that she had prayed even as death closed its hands around her. Some whispered that her soul had ascended intact through the smoke, untouched by the world's corruption. To a war-weary land, her death was not simply shocking, it was mesmerizing. The samurai world had rules, unwritten but ironbound. Women were to submit, to endure, to live and die as tools of their houses. To kill oneself rather than be captured was permitted, but only as an act of loyalty to a husband's name. Garasha's death fit none of these patterns. She had not died for her husband's honor. Tadaoki had not even been present. She had not died in defiance of capture as a warrior would, screaming her name in glory. She had died in perfect silence, choosing not to be used at all. In a world obsessed with obedience, her refusal was as dazzling as it was incomprehensible. The Jesuits, too, were stunned. Secret Christians who had known her hidden faith whispered her baptismal name in reverence. To them, she was a martyr, a woman who had chosen death rather than let her soul be dragged into political sin. Letters describing her final act sailed from Nagasaki to Macau, from Macau to Lisbon and Rome. In Europe, she became a symbol of Christian purity, flowering in the blood-soaked soil of Japan, proof that even in the samurai world's brutality, grace could take root. In the months that followed, the myth of Garasha bloomed like a ghostly flower across the land. Poets composed elegies likening her to a camellia, falling untarnished from its stem. Playwrights hinted at her story in coded lines, slipping it past censors. Even the court nobles who had once scorned her father spoke of her with hushed admiration, as though she had transcended the very cycle of blood and duty that had trapped them all. And in this strange transformation, something else quietly shifted. The shadow over the name Akechi began to fade. For 18 years, Mitsuhide's memory had been a stain. Parents had used his name to frighten children. Lords had spat it as a curse. His betrayal at Honnō-ji had become the defining cautionary tale of ambition. But now people spoke of his daughter's death in the same breath. They said it was proof that even in the house of a traitor, purity could be born. They began to wonder if Mitsuhide himself had been more than just a rebel, if perhaps the man who raised such a daughter had not been wholly consumed by darkness. Tadaoki, ever cold and calculating, recognized the power of this shift. He ordered a small Christian chapel erected near their Kyoto estate to honor her memory. a gesture that startled many, for he had always opposed the foreign faith. It was not devotion, it was strategy. He understood that Garasha's death had made her more valuable than she had ever been alive. By sanctifying her memory, he could cloak the Hosokawa house in her radiance and wash away the lingering stain of her Akechi blood. At Sekigahara, the Hosokawa fought like demons on the Tokugawa side, carving through Ishida's lines in a frenzy of steel. When victory came, Tadaoki stood on the smoking field as one of Ieyasu's trusted generals. The Tokugawa would rule Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. Yet even amid the triumph, whispers of Garasha swirled like falling leaves through the camps. Soldiers who had never seen her spoke her name as though it were a prayer. In the years after the Tokugawa ascendancy, her legend only deepened. Artists painted her as a serene figure, wrapped in pale robes, haloed in smoke. Christian converts carried tiny portraits of her hidden in amulets. The shogunate, wary of Christianity, eventually banned open veneration of her, but it was too late. She had entered the realm of memory that cannot be censored, and beneath it all, silently, the redemption of her father advanced. No proclamations were issued, no monuments built, yet the venom faded from the name Akechi. Where once it had meant only betrayal, now it carried a strange dual note, tragedy and grace. People said Mitsuhide had destroyed his house, but his daughter had raised its ghost to heaven. It was a paradox the samurai mind could not resolve, and so it lingered, haunting. She had lived as the exile's daughter, the traitor's shadow. She had died as something unclassifiable, outside the order of men's understanding. And in doing so, she had accomplished what Mitsuhide had never been able to achieve. She had broken free of the world's chains. The flower that had grown from the ashes of Akechi Mitsuhide was not of this earth. Years passed. The storms of Sekigahara faded into the long, cold stillness of Tokugawa rule. The age of chaos receded behind walls and schedules, its roaring silenced by bureaucratic order. Castles became palaces, swords became heirlooms, and the children of warriors learned calligraphy instead of war. The names of the men who had torn Japan apart dulled into lines and chronicles, but her name did not fade. Hosokawa Garasha became something stranger than a memory. She became a presence. Even as the Tokugawa shogunate outlawed Christianity and drove it underground, her story slipped through the cracks like moonlight. Women whispered it in the back corridors of daimyo mansions. Poets alluded to it in veiled verses. Secret Christians carried her image in hidden amulets, seeing in her death a mirror of the martyrs of their faith. To them, she was not merely a woman who chose death. She was a soul who had chosen eternity over power, silence over compromise. She never left the Hosokawa household entirely. Tadaoki commissioned a portrait of her in her lavender chrysanthemum robes, serene and unsmiling, and hung it in a quiet alcove. He rarely spoke of her, yet visitors noted the way he paused before the painting, gaze shadowed, as though confronting something he could not name. The retainers bowed to her image as they passed. Even those who had once watched her with suspicion now spoke of her with reverence, their voices lowered as if she might still hear. And in Kyoto, far from the Hosokawa estates, moss grew thick over the stones of Sakamoto Castle. The lake lapped softly at its ruined base. No banners flew there now, no songs echoed in its halls. The wind whispered through shattered corridors where Tama had once practiced her brushwork under her father's solemn gaze. The world had erased Akechi Mitsuhide as completely as it could. No monuments, no honors, only the faint echo of his name in history's margins, always preceded by the word traitor. Yet he was not gone. He lingered in the unease with which people spoke of him, in the way storytellers could not resist his ghost. He had been the man who shattered the unshatterable, who toppled Nobunaga, the pillar of their age, in a single morning. They could not forgive him, but they could not forget him either. And as Garasha's legend grew, the shape of his shadow began to change. People started to speak of them together. The traitor and the martyr, the blade and the flower, the man who destroyed his world, and the woman who redeemed it. They wondered aloud how such purity could have come from such ruin, How a man consumed by ambition could have raised a daughter so luminous. Some even whispered that perhaps he had not been mere ambition at all. Perhaps he had been trying, in his flawed and furious way, to save something. They could not prove it, but they could not shake the suspicion. In this way, she became his absolution. Decades later, when the Tokugawa regime had frozen Japan into stillness and most of the old warlords were dust, a Jesuit priest passing secretly through Kyoto visited the garden where the Hosokawa mansion had once stood. The garden was quiet, empty but for scattered camellias drifting across the moss. He wrote in his journal that he felt he was walking through a miracle that had burned itself into the stones, a place where something holy had once chosen to vanish. He asked an old retainer tending the grounds if the Lady Garasha had truly been as serene as the stories said. The retainer paused, looking out across the fallen petals. She was quieter, he said, than the world deserved. Far away at the ruins of Sakamoto, the lake breeze stirred the reeds along the shore. No one visited. No offerings were made. The world had passed it by. Yet every spring, without fail, a single white lily bloomed between the cracked stones of the old courtyard, pale and perfect against the dark rock. Travelers who stumbled upon it sometimes whispered that it was her, Garasha, returning each year to keep vigil. But perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was him. Not the warlord, not the traitor, not the man who set the capital on fire, but the father who had once bent over her tiny hands as she learned to hold a brush, who had tried in his broken way to build a world where she might be safe and failed. Perhaps the lily bloomed not as forgiveness nor as penance, but simply as proof that even the most ruined things can leave behind beauty. And so the story ends, not with the clash of armies or the blaze of empires, but with a ghost and a flower, his shadow fading into the moss, her radiance enduring in silence, bound together beyond history, beyond victory or defeat. The blade that cut the world and the bloom that outlived it.